Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we're here for my LCS week number 2 overview and analysis video for the spring split. Very excited to get into it. LCS is really starting to kick off. Of course, still only 8 games per week in the LCS. That's going to change next weekend when we have our Super Week with games on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, starting, of course, tomorrow, today, I guess, as this video is coming out for a lot of you people. But I'm very excited to kind of cover the LCS. I think this has been kind of an interesting offseason, like I talked about, and, you know, maybe there aren't a ton of upsets right now, but the games themselves, I think, have been pretty fun to watch. The broadcast itself, I think, has been very fun to watch because of just the amount of action that we're getting. Yes, the pauses are a little high, but, you know, the amount of game versus non-game content, I think, has been very, very nice. It's very welcome after having watched a lot of the other regions, and generally, I think the broadcast itself is very good. So covering LCS is a lot of fun, but I would love to hear what you guys thought of the LCS in week number 2 down in the comment section below. What teams do you think are doing well? What teams are exciting you? What teams aren't exciting you? What do you want to talk about when it comes to the LCS? Would just love to hear all of your thoughts and opinions in the comment section. Of course, if you are new here, what we're going to do in this video is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we talk about. And then at the end of the week, I'll be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, I will also be updating my power rankings for all 8 teams at the end of the week, kind of talking about who I think is moving in the right or the wrong direction. But without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. We get to start with day number 1, our Saturday slate of games, and kicking us off in Saturday, it was a matchup between Dignitas and Cloud9 that Cloud9 was able to take, again, relatively easily. This has been a very good start to the split for Cloud9. You basically couldn't ask for anything else from the super team that everybody had major expectations for going into this year. They have lived up to those expectations, at least at the start. They've made even good teams like Energy look relatively bad just because they've been able to outplay and outskill a lot of these teams in terms of execution. And I think that's very encouraging. Dignitas got a bit of hype in week number 1 because of that win over Immortals. They went 1-1, which I think, you know, was pretty good for a team that was predicted, you know, pretty clearly in the bottom 2 to start the year. But I do think maybe some of the hype surrounding Dignitas is somehow even a little bit higher than maybe I would give them. I hear a lot of people saying they're the, quote, best of the rest. I don't really know what that means. Does that mean they're the 5th best team in the league? If that's the case, I'm certainly not sure I agree with that. This was not a very good game from them. But for Cloud9, you know, you're living up to the bill. You're really exactly what you could expect. And I think the thing that's the most encouraging is it's not the players that are returning from Cloud9 last year. Well, it is. I mean, Blabber is still fantastic. He's going to get my player of the game here, as you can see on the screen. But it's the combination of Blabber and JoJo and how they play off of each other that's really giving me so much confidence that this team is legit. These two already look like one of the best jungle mid duos we've seen in the LCS in a long time. Their synergy is outstanding. They really know exactly how to play with each other. Blabber's going for a lot of aggressive plays in the mid game, and JoJo is constantly winning lane, constantly pushed up, constantly in a good position, to the point where he's always in a spot to go and help Blabber and make his job a lot easier. Generally, these two just complement each other playstyle-wise really well. Playing something like Nocturne Orianna can sometimes be a little bit difficult because that combo is kind of hard to pull off if you want to go for long-range engages, but, you know, we saw them really know how to execute on that. Orianna throwing the ball onto Nocturne and then casting Shockwave just as it gets out of range of you know, Orianna ball going back, and, you know, being able to hit that Shockwave from a crazy distance with the Nocturne. It's really impressive stuff. It's great execution from 2 of the most talented players in the LCS, and it's not just that, it's their macro. It's knowing where to be on the map. Blabber was everywhere here. That's why he's getting player of the game, as he just really controlled the tempo and the pacing of this game. XU is a very interesting young jungle prospect that I think showed some good things in week number 1. However, Blabber really took advantage of him in this game, and that's okay. You can live with that because XU is, you know, somebody who's just not had a ton of experience at this level, but Blabber was amazing, and he continued to look, you know, fantastic after a great week number 1 for him as well. JoJo was my player of the week in week 1. I think he definitely followed that up nicely. Orianna's not necessarily a champion that people would associate with him as a player, but he still plays everything at an incredibly high level. He's not just a carry assassin player. He can play control mages and still take over games. He's a lot more versatile, I think, than people give him credit for, and I think that definitely played into this here. So those two really looking good. Fudge did a really good job in the top lane matchup. You know, if there was one place that you could look at and say, okay, Dignitas might be able to play through this lane and actually be able to keep up in terms of skill, it's Rich, because Rich is really good, but they put Rich on tank duty, they put him on Ornn, and he's not really able to do anything in the early game. Fudge actually gets some gold on the Rumble, and all of a sudden it becomes a lot more difficult. Berserker was on a winning lane in the Kalista Renata down in the bot lane. Him and Vulcan are playing well to start the year. They've basically been given no resources. They've just played isolated in the 2v2, all split long so far, but it's really working out for them because both of them are able to outskill their opponents. But so far, Cloud9's really been about the jungle mid duo, and I think that is a very exciting thing to say. And then for Dignitas on the other side, just not good enough. I mean, there's really no other way to say it. I'm not even really blaming them. Like, they really shouldn't be good enough. Their team is really not talented enough to be able to go up against Cloud9, but that was really the crux of this. I think some people are going to look at Tomo and Isles and say, okay, well, they actually had relatively good mid game. The Aphelios was dealing damage. The Milio was actually creating some problems for Cloud9 in some of these mid-game skirmishes, but the absolute outskilling that happened where Cloud9 put their resources, which is in the mid lane, is very noticeable. Dead of the game is going to go to Dove. You know, I thought he was better than I certainly was expecting in week number 1. He was actually pretty darn good in week number 1, and I had Dove as a pretty low-ranking player. In my player rankings, I called him the worst signing of the offseason for the LCS because I just didn't see it as an upside signing. This was more of what I was expecting from Dove, just somebody who never really had any sort of prio in his lane, was constantly getting dove by the enemy jungler, and just ended up, you know, doing 0 damage and being really not useful throughout the entirety of this game. Again, it's not entirely his fault because there were so many resources put into him, but he was the weak link for Dignitas in this game. XU also just got out jungled. There really is no other way to say it. He had no tempo, no pressure on this map. He was late to every objective. It's just something that's going to happen when a very young, inexperienced jungler goes up against Blabber, who is just one of the most dominating stranglehold junglers that the West has. So generally, I'm not going to blame Dignitas too much. I think this game was fine for them. Like I said, Tomo and Isles showed some good things, especially in the mid game. Rich, maybe on a different pick other than the Ornn, could express maybe some skill expression a bit more in a matchup like this, but, you know, Blabber and JoJo are phenomenal. To lose to them when they're playing like this, it's certainly not a negative. Cloud9 really does genuinely feel unstoppable. I know it's only 3 games in, it's such a small sample size, but those 3 games have been so dominant, they've been so good, and the expectations for this team were already so high that it's hard not to say that, you know, this team is exactly living up to the expectations and the hype that I think we all generated around them in the offseason. And now moving on to game 2 of day 1 here. Another pretty interesting one. 2 1-1 teams going head-to-head. Energy taking on 100 Thieves. And Energy does pick up their 2nd win of the year. This is not a particularly big upset, but this game was very fun and very close. A lot of really big positives to take away, I think, from both teams in this one. First of all, I was probably right in not dropping Energy too low. After last week's loss to Cloud9, I saw some people putting them below number 2. I kept them at number 2 in my power rankings. I thought pretty clearly this team still looked good, and that, you know, I wanted to see them not be the 2nd best team in the league before I anointed them as anything other than the 2nd best team in the league at the current moment. Losing to Cloud9 doesn't do too much to change my opinion on that, and all they've done since then is look really good. Now, there are some inconsistencies in their game, but for the most part, this is a very well-rounded team, and there's a reason they're still at the top of the standings. And for 100 Thieves on the other side, you know, this team shows a lot of guts, a lot of heart. I think a lot of the players on this team are actually playing really well right now. It's unfortunate that they can't just get a consistent performance out of all 5 members through one game. They got it in that Team Liquid performance, kind of, for the most part. And then outside of that, it's been sporadic good performances from a lot of these players. 4 of these players played really well in this game, in my opinion. It's just unfortunate that all 5 couldn't do it, but we'll talk about that in a second. Starting with Energy, player of the game for me is going to go to FBI. I very much debated between him and Palafox. For a lot of this, I think Palafox had a very underratedly great game. You don't look at the scoreline and say, wow, he really dominated on Azir, but that late game team fighting was phenomenal. He really saved the game in a lot of different circumstances with both the damage and the ultimates that he was bringing out on the Azir, but I ended up with FBI because, man, was he impactful on a champion that even I have been criticizing over the past couple of years as a pro pick, right? We've really gone towards a meta where damage is super crucial. A lot of these more utility-oriented marksmen, you know, things like the Jhin and the Ashe just haven't been as important in the recent years as they were in like 2017, 2018, you know, 2016, around that time when you were getting a lot of damage from other parts of the map. You really need hyper carries down in the bot lane typically, or you need something that's very consistently going to be able to win early. Jhin just doesn't offer that in the same way that other champions do, but he does offer consistency. That is something that Jhin does better than almost any other champion. It's very rare for Jhin to be taken out of a game and just be completely useless because of all that he offers, you know, the CC and the damage kind of combination, the range that he offers with the ultimate, and, you know, just all of that stuff. But FBI made this champion look ridiculously strong in this particular instance. Meech and Ayla actually had a very good game. Meech's positioning on Varus was really good. I thought Ayla was also very good on the Rakan, but FBI and Huhi were just slightly better, and I think that was the big reason why Energy ended up coming out on top. Huhi playing the Ashe, very fun here. Fun to see Jhin Ashe as a bot lane duo. Talk about one of the most annoying bot lanes you could probably play into at a pro level. There's just constant barrage of stuff coming at you over and over again, but that's FBI and Huhi going up against their former organization, the last org they played together as a duo in. You know, it was really fun to see them, you know, kind of just have a really good game generally, but like I said, Palafox, FBI, Huhi, looking good. There were moments where Dokka was just a little bit too far forward on the Jace. You know, it's a pick that I think is considered, you know, kind of signature for him at this point, but he's actually not been phenomenal to start the year. He's been a little bit more inconsistent than maybe you would like in the top lane matchup. I think there is a reasonable argument to be made that Sniper was actually better in this game, but still, I'm not super worried. Bot lane was amazing. Mid lane has been really good for this team to start, and Contracts is a very good player. Energy's very well-rounded, which is a big reason why I have so much confidence in them. And then for 100 Thieves, again, 4 out of the 5 players on this team I thought played really well. We already talked a bit about Meech and Ayla. I thought their contributions, especially towards the back half of this game, were very clutch. The Varus damage is super high, and Ayla had some amazing engages and honestly amazing disengages and re-engages on the Rakan as well to kind of stop the aggression that Energy was showing towards the back half. You really have to be able to pull the trigger in this comp on the Rakan with the Sejuani, with the Cassante, because you're going into a team that has so much range and damage advantage on you, especially because you don't really have a strong assassin in this game, and so Ayla really had to play well, and I think he almost played underratedly very good in this game. River controls tempo better than almost any other jungler in the LCS. He is so good at establishing just where he wants his team to be at any given time, and, you know, playing these more tanky initiators, he really gets to pick and choose where he wants to make those plays happen. He's a very smart player. His macro is very good. His pathing is amazing. The problem was just that, you know, it wasn't good. It wasn't quite good enough in this game. And then, you know, I thought Sniper was really good on the Cassante. I was a bit worried about him after week number 1, where I thought he was just okay. Certainly, you know, a player that I think we all expected to take some time to get up to speed, because he really has not played at a level like this before. And not only that, but even in tier 2, he was definitely, I'm not going to say struggling, because he was still probably like an upper half top laner in spring, but he wasn't like a top 5 top laner in the NACL or anything like that when he was playing. So, you know, it was definitely a player that I think I was willing to give some leeway and breathing room to, but, you know, he was pretty good in this. He's been better than I thought he was going to be at the start of his LCS career. I'll just say that. But dud of the game is going to go to Quid in the mid lane. He was the one player across basically everybody here that I was just not feeling in this game. If Akali was relevant, I think 100 Thieves have a really good shot to win this, but Quid played really poorly in this game, and that was my concern with 100 Thieves going into the season, is I've never really been on the Quid hype train. You know, I definitely understand them wanting to give him another shot here after really last summer's team was very weird, very different, very strange vibes, but, you know, I think there is reason to be a bit more pessimistic about Quid. Now, he was pretty good in week number 1, and obviously one bad game is not enough for me to say, like, oh, obviously I was right, but these are the kinds of performances, and generally this is the kind of inconsistency, even when the rest of his team is doing well, that kind of put me off on Quid in the first place, is that game to game is just not there. I want to see that improve. It's the mechanics that do concern me a bit, is at times he's in the right spots, but sometimes he just fails to execute on good situations, which is, to me, more concerning than somebody who is very good at executing in situations that they probably shouldn't be in the first place. And so, you know, we'll end up seeing, you know, what happens with Quid, but he definitely was the dud of the game here in this one. But generally, 100 Thieves definitely earned that move up to number 5. They do feel like the best of the rest. There's a lot of best of the rest thrown about right now in terms of kind of comments, you know, the bottom, you know, 4 or 5 teams in the league. 100 Thieves definitely feel like they are in that conversation as one of the better bottom 4, if not the best bottom 4 team in the league at the current moment, bottom half team. And, you know, I think that's pretty fair. A lot of this team is really good. I think River will keep them in a lot of games, and Meech and Ayla are developing well. This is really their first kind of game at all at the LCS level where they're not playing something super passive like Senna, and so really good to see them perform, but I just don't know if this year is going to be the one where they reach, like, you know, top 4, top 3 or anything like that. But for Energy, this is a very good team. Even when things aren't going perfectly, they have enough tools to be able to play through the parts of the map that are going well for them. I really liked how they played here. FBI continues to be an incredibly underrated player in the LCS, and generally, I feel pretty vindicated for keeping them at 2 right now. Then moving on to the third game of day one here, and this one was definitely more interesting. Two of the top four teams for a lot of people, Team Liquid, taking on FlyQuest, and FlyQuest is going to be able to pick up a pretty clean, pretty easy win here, and this honestly is more concerning for TL than I think it is good for FlyQuest. This was a bad game from Team Liquid, and it's not the first bad game that they've had. They should not have lost to 100 Thieves, and even if they should have lost to FlyQuest here, the way that they lost is just very uninspiring. This does not feel like a particularly good League of Legends team at the current moment. All of these players have pretty clear flaws, and that includes the ones that, people are defending on social media. I don't think any of the 5 players on this team right now are filling me with a ton of confidence really in any facet, but for FlyQuest, this is genuinely a good team. How good? I guess we'll find out later in the week when they go up against Energy, but at least for now, this is obviously a very nice win. I think they had a very unique, interesting draft. They went for the Mordekaiser, the Ezreal, and the Karma, 3 things that we're just not seeing a ton elsewhere. The Trundle, very popular in North America, at least on the patch that we are on, but not so popular in a lot of other regions. I like Trundle. I think it's in a pretty good spot. Mordekaiser is always a champion that's going to be relevant in pro play just because you can always use that ultimate to good effect. Like, there is never a circumstance in which that ultimate is not useful. And then Ezreal Karma is really good into something like Lucian Nami to be able to take away a lot of the mid-game prio that they want to generate. So generally, I really like this FlyQuest draft, and I think they executed on it well. Player of the game for me is going to go to Bwipo in the top lane. I think Broadcast gave it to Inspired. That's also fine. The Trundle was very valuable, moving around the map, creating a lot of advantages for the team. He was the one probably setting up the most amount of plays. I think Inspired's macro in this game was really good. That's something he's always been really good at. He's a great fighter, and I think really one of the things that Inspired does at a super high level, and one of the reasons that I separate him from a lot of the other junglers kind of around him and why he's like a top 2 jungler in the region for me, is because he's good at every phase of the game, right? His early game is really solid. He knows where he needs to be. His pathing is great, and he's very good at getting his laners ahead. His mid game is very good. His objective control is solid, and he's a phenomenal team fighter. Honestly, that's probably the best part of his game, is his ability to fight towards the back half. He really doesn't have a big weakness. He's just very good in every stage of the game, and I think we kind of saw that with the Trundle here, but I think the most impactful, player in the back half of this game was certainly Bwipo on the Mordekaiser. That champion's just so stupid. I'm known to not like a Mordekaiser here or there, but, Bwipo made the champion look incredibly strong in this particular instance. It's just so hard to deal with if you're already from a losing position. I think he did a great job putting himself in a really smart spot in a lot of these team fights in the back half of the game to really maximize what Mord could do, but he was unkillable, and he was doing a ridiculous amount of damage in some of these team fights. So to me, he was the most impactful player towards FlyQuest's win. Again, if you wanted to give it to Inspire, I would understand. Masu and Busio looked very good in this game, particularly Busio on the Karma. One of the concerns with Busio was, is he going to be as good when he doesn't have these super high mobility engage tools? That's always kind of been the kind of player that Busio is. The Rakans, the Alistairs, things like that he's always been a bit better on than, the Enchanters. But this was a really good Karma game. I think the Ezreal Karma very much worked. They very much outplayed Yon and Core, specifically Yon on the other side of this. Jensen was fine on the Orianna, really just enabled a lot of the Bruisers to be a little bit more aggressive in some of these fights. And, generally, I think Fly did a good job playing together as a unit, but this really was more of a bad Team Liquid game, like I said, than I think a good FlyQuest game, which is a little frustrating to say because, I think there is reason to think that Team Liquid could get themselves out of this hole, but right now they're just such an uninspiring team in terms of the LCS. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Yon in the AD carry role. He is probably the most clear example of, a stylistic player that I could possibly give you. And it's a weird style. It's not one that you see often in the AD carry role, but he is a very good laner. Typically, he wasn't quite very good in this game, but typically speaking, he's a very good laner early on in games, isolated in the 2v2. He knows how to play a lot of those matchups. He knows how to generate leads. He's just not a good team fighter. He is just not very good in the back half of the game, constantly putting himself in bad positions, overextending, trying to do either too much or alternatively not doing anything like he did for a lot of this game, just staying way too far back on the Lucian, not really playing him as this poke mage assassin hybrid that Lucian ends up being in a lot of these fights. He was useless in this game, and he's going to get Dud of the game for it. I know there's a lot of negativity surrounding Lucian as a champion, but what we've seen from the LPL and the LCK is that there are ways to use Lucian well. I think a lot of people in the West see him as this lane bully, this lane dominant champion. That's not really what Lucian is. He doesn't beat champions like Draven and Karma in the early game, or he's not going to be able to outpoke an Ezreal in the laning phase, but what Lucian does better than a lot of other AD carries is destroy these isolated 3v3s around objectives in the mid game. That's where you have to start playing super aggro. If you can poke out the Ezreal, if you can poke out the Trundle or the Mordekaiser early on in fights, a full combo from Lucian after 1 or 2 items will kill those champions. You have to play them kind of like an assassin, and I don't know. It just felt like Jan was way too passive in this one, and I needed to see more. APA continues to struggle, at least at the start of this split. Don't really know what to expect from him going into year number 2. I thought he was better than people gave him credit for in year 1, but it's certainly not translated to the start of 2024, where he just was way too he was the opposite. He was way too aggro on this Trist, constantly going in without a lot of backup. is completely uninspired, pun intended, in this matchup. You know, I kind of saw that coming. is a player who either snowballs a game out of control or he just doesn't do anything, and that's what we've seen. Impact just wasn't useful at all in the Cassante, and Court played Nami in a matchup where bot lane lost super early. There's just not a lot that this team was ever going to do. They look lifeless, they look boring, they look passive, and they look like they have some major holes in some key positions. I'm really not excited about this Team Liquid team, and I think this game was kind of an encapsulation of that. But good for Fly, moving to 3-0. The real big test comes later in the week against Energy. They've had a pretty easy road up until this point. Team Liquid, probably the hardest team that they've played over the course of the beginning section. As much as I like them, I really need to see them, you know, take down one of the teams in the top 2 before I think that they're going to be a top 2 team, but they've done everything they're supposed to do up until this point, so you got to give them credit on that front. And then moving on to our 4th and final game of the first day here in week number 2, and it's a battle of the 2 winless teams from week number 1, Immortals taking on Shopify Rebellion. And maybe in a bit of a surprise, Immortals is actually going to grab the win in this game. Shopify moving to 0-3 to start their tenure in the LCS. Very similar to, you know, another org, maybe in the LEC right now, who just recently joined that league and also took a while to buy a win. Shopify also struggling out of the gate as the new organization here in the LCS, but Immortals, congrats to them. They were able to pick up their first win of the season. I think a lot of people thought it was going to take a little while with this roster and how they performed in week number 1, but this was a pretty good game from them. This was a very complete game. They were definitely the better team. It wasn't particularly close, and generally, I think, you know, they've shown a lot of signs of life, at the very least, some fight in them that, you know, maybe some other teams around the world right now just aren't showing when they're at the bottom of the standings. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Armeo, the jungler here. He played Lilia in this game and really was able to get a lot of those Lilia things off. I think we are constantly, as a community, hyping up this champion, Lilia, talking about how she's able to take over games and asking why she isn't as played at the pro level as she is in solo queue or in challenger. I think for the most part, a lot of those questions can pretty easily be answered by the fact that Lilia does struggle sometimes to fit into more generalized team comps. When you want to go something that's a little bit more safe in the mid lane, typically speaking, all of the safe options in the mid lane are AP, and so you don't really want to double up on those. That means you also probably want to go something a bit more aggressive in the bot lane. You know, it's just difficult to fit Lilia onto a comp with the way that teams like to build specific comps. But I think if you can fit her in, if you want to play Jace in the mid lane, if you want to play something a lot more passive in the bot lane like a Jhin, then Lilia does make a bit more sense. You just kind of have to move around a lot of the other meta pieces in order to fit her in. But I thought Armeo did a really good job here. The tempo that Lilia is able to generate is almost unparalleled in terms of the junglers that are actually seeing play at a competitive level, and there's a reason that she is able to really snowball games out of control. You give Lilia an inch, she's going to take a mile as a champion. I thought Armeo did a really good job of piloting her in this game. The amount of damage that champion can put out so consistently is actually ridiculously high considering the amount of utility she also just offers on her own. And so really good stuff. Definitely out-jungled Boogie. Easily the best game of the split for Armeo. One of the players that I felt the best about going into this year on Immortals. But the other player was obviously Tactical, who I think a lot of people have been saying is elo stuck on this team. I think that to an extent is true, but you know, the rest of the team very much stepped up. Tactical still played well, and Jhin over the course of this week actually looked pretty good, which is certainly an interesting development, but him and Ole are actually showing some signs of life. Ole, I still think I'm a bit more passive on in terms of the overall outlook, but Tactical seems like he's going to be at the very least what he was last year for this team. An interesting piece, maybe not perfect from game to game, but somebody who does have mechanical upside that can win matchups that you're not probably going to get out of other AD carries that you might be able to sign from a team at this level. 8th place, you know, last place in the LCS. Castle and Mask still look like they're going to take some time to get used to being like hyper consistent, but Castle in particular did a really good job in the top lane matchup. Fake God has not been good in the LCS so far this split. Hopefully that gets better, but I thought Mask had a pretty good game as well in the Jace generally. Immortals was just fine. I don't think there was really any big standout moments from them. They kind of just controlled the tempo and were able to close the game. It wasn't this dominating performance where there was a ton of mechanical outplays and some crazy ceiling that we hadn't seen from some of these players, but you know, they executed on what they had pretty well. They won in draft and they were able to do that well. And then for Shopify, you are starting to get a bit concerned about this team. I think there's a lot of blame to go around. Some of it is landing in places that I don't necessarily think is accurate. I think the two places that you're mostly seeing blame for with Shopify right now, first of all, the coaching staff for this draft. I think a lot of people are looking at this draft and saying it's unwinnable. I certainly don't agree that it's unwinnable. That term in general in pro play is just almost impossible to throw around, in my opinion. I've talked about this in previous years. I very much push back on the idea that any draft is unwinnable if you're good enough, as we've seen from the best teams in the world. T1 or SKT for so many years had the worst drafts in the entire world, and they continued to beat everyone. If you're good enough, you can win anything. Basically, every draft has a win condition, and this draft does have a win condition. I just understand what you're saying with, like, Nocturne and Akali don't exactly have perfect synergy. You're wondering where the Rel fits into this equation because you want to start, like, these front-to-back team fights, but then you've also got 2 assassins, so I understand kind of the anti-synergy, but there are ways to win this, and mostly it's getting ahead. The other player that I see receiving a lot of the negative, press from this game and a lot of the blame is Bvoy, who is in the bot lane. Wild Turtle, played week number 1. I don't know if it was just Bvoy not being here yet, or if they wanted to play Wild Turtle. I assume it was Bvoy not being here yet, and he's back here for week number 2. He was easily the best player on this team this game, not even just in scoreline, but in terms of the mechanical prowess he showed. He really didn't make that many mistakes. He was actually pretty good for this team, but, everybody loves Wild Turtle, and so when he gets taken out and Bvoy comes in and the team loses, even though they lost with Wild Turtle, people are going to point the blame at him. I still think Bvoy's probably a slightly better player than Wild Turtle from what we've seen most recently from him at a high level, and it was really nice to see him actually, be okay and be the best player on this team in a game where jungle mid ended up collapsing super hard, and Zeyzal, honestly just didn't play all that well on the Rel. For Bvoy to still look good in that circumstance, I think is good, but also this guy's probably had like a max 4 to 5 days to practice and train with this team and, get ready for this stage game. I'm willing to cut him a little bit of slack. You see so many people, basically every single comment on social media after this game was, how stupid is this org for putting washed up Bvoy in instead of Wild Turtle? I don't think that's a fair statement at all to make. I think that is a huge overreaction from, quite frankly, a fan base that I'm usually pretty on the side of. I think generally, I've talked about this, the LCS fan base is usually the best one in terms of, post-game, talking about things that actually go right or wrong, not overreacting. I think this is a miss, clearly. I think Bvoy is a pretty good player, and we got to see a lot more from him before we just start making these generalized statements. But Fake God continues to really struggle. Boogie continues to really struggle. He's going to get dead of the game here. Armeo very much out-jungled him, but the Nocturne had no impact. A lot of times we're seeing this happen with Nocturne in pro play. Generally, I'm pretty anti this pick. I've talked about it a lot last year, when not only in the LCS, but everywhere, even in the LPL and the LCK, this champion just doesn't generally do a lot of work. Oftentimes you're diving into the backline in the late game and just trading 1-for-1, which is very rarely useful for a team unless you have a really high priority target that you can trade for. But if that target is so high priority, likely they're strong and they can probably just beat you and kill you before you can get on them anyways. And so I don't really know what the point of Nocturne is. I think Nico is the strong part of that duo, and oftentimes Nocturne just gets a nice reputation because Nico is strong, but now that you take the Nico out, you can see the flaws of that champion, and I think we definitely saw that. Boogie, he's a fine player, but I think he really didn't have a lot of options this game, especially once he got behind. I think Insanity played really poorly on the Akali. I would have liked to see a lot more mechanics shown, but he was getting outplayed in a lot of these fights, was very scared to go in, and ended up just getting out snowballed. Like I said, Fake God's laning has been atrocious to start this year. Bvoy really was the only positive for Shopify across this game, and that is at least a little bit of a concern. If this team doesn't have a winning topside, then it's gonna be really hard for them to win games. They're 0-3. They're the worst team in the LCS right now, and it's for a reason, and it's because right now jungle mid are not clicking. Even though I like both of them as players, especially Insanity, it's certainly not been what they were last year, and Fake God has very much struggled to transition back into the LCS, and so hopefully things can figure themselves out for Shopify, but nice win for Immortals. I'm not going to freak out. This doesn't suddenly make them an interesting team, but again, they at least showed that they can win if they're given a good situation, which I think is something that was on the table as a potential concern for them, even in the best situation. So nice to see Immortals pick up their first win, and I think a lot of people are going to be excited that they're not the team that was winless for the longest in the LCS. And now moving on to day number 2, our second half of week number 2 here, and we kicked it off with a battle between 1 and 2 teams, Dignitas and 100 Thieves. The 100 Thieves is going to be able to pick up the win, and they're going to move to 500 at the end of the first 2 weeks. Dignitas moving to 1-3 with this loss. Obviously not ideal for them, but hardly unexpected for a team that I think a lot of people put in the bottom 2 of their rankings. 100 Thieves showed a lot of good things in week number 1, especially with that win over Liquid, and they were able to carry that into another really nice game here in week number 2. Are they a top tier team? Like, are they guaranteed a top 4 team in the league? I don't know. Probably not. I don't know. Liquid doesn't look all that good, so it might actually be an open spot for them at the current moment, but it's certainly not guaranteed. But what they are is better than the bottom, and I think that honestly is already a very encouraging sign for an organization that's kind of going through a bit of a rebuild right now. So let's go ahead and go over this game in particular. Player of the game for me is going to go to Quid in the mid lane. Very happy to be able to say that. I've been very hard on Quid, just generally over the course of his LCS career. I was already kind of low on him after his time in LCK Challengers. As somebody who watches that league a lot, there were just a lot of good and a lot of bad to take away from his time in Challengers. He certainly wasn't a finished product. He was a player who really was given a ton of resources and a ton of just attention generally in the mid lane on Gen G Challengers because they just didn't have any other players that were playing well at the time. I've never seen a developmental team, play through one player nearly as hard as that team played through Quid. I understand why that would attract the attention of an organization like 100 Thieves, but I was a bit concerned, especially with the fit on the team last year with players like Closer and Double Lift that really like attention, whether or not that was going to work out. He was not very good in his first year, and I do think it's been a bit slow here to start the second year as well, or at least I guess the first full year in the league, but this is probably the best game that he has played on stage in the LCS. He is a scrim god. That's kind of the report, is that he is somebody who is consistently dominating scrims, but this is really the first time we got to see it on stage. The Azir positioning was great. The ultimates towards the back half of the game were amazing. There were actually moments where Dig players, really kept this game interesting. Rich, Dove, Tomo, I think all had relatively good games here. Akali was going in, trying to get an assassination on the Varus in the back half of the game. A perfect ultimate coming out from Quid to be able to save that team fight, and all of a sudden the game is basically over because the Akali can't get on any of the backliners in front to back 100 Thieves just win. It's really good stuff from Quid. This is the mid laner that we were promised. This is the player with upside that they were consistently talking about. If he plays like this more frequently, 100 Thieves is going to be in a pretty good spot. He's gonna have to do it more consistently though, because it hasn't been that way over the course of his career yet. I also think Meech and Ayla continue to look awesome. Meech finally gets to play some AD carries this week. Last week, obviously, he was, saddled on, Senna duty for basically the whole week, and that's fine. It just didn't really get to show off kind of his skill set that we have come to know from him in the NACL. He got to play some Varus this week, and I think that's definitely much more of a positive for him. He was awesome in both games, but especially in this one where he was really able to take over in the mid game. Really good arrows, lots of good damage, really good positioning. Meech has honestly exceeded my expectations for what he was going to offer at the beginning of a split. I really thought this team was going to take some time to get together, but River has been amazing in terms of his early games, and I think that's really helped the team out. If Quid and Meech and Sniper and Ayla and these young players can really form something super early on, that's way ahead of schedule, I think, of what they were already expecting. This could be a top 4 team by the end of spring split, and that's pretty crazy. This is a team that is definitely going to be in the conversation for being one of the more interesting ones as we move throughout the year. And then for Dig on the other side, I'm glad that they had that big win in week 1 over Immortals. Dove was playing relatively well. Rich is always a player that keeps things interesting because it does raise the expectations a bit for this team. And so far, Dig has been exactly what a lot of bottom LCS teams have been over the last few years. Maybe not the bottom, not number 1 bottom, but bottom 2, bottom 3 LCS teams have been, which is really tough outs. Honestly, I don't think the LCS gets credit enough for the fact that we don't really, at least over the past year, going back to the beginning of 2023, our teams don't just really roll over and die anymore. We rarely have these games that are just complete blowouts. Teams try to win in this region, which is not something you can say about every region playing from behind. But I think Dig is going to be a tough out. I just don't know if they have enough skill to actually be able to win any of these games. Rich, Dove, and Tomo all did their jobs here. Tomo was relatively good on the Jhin. Dove was doing a lot of work on the Akali, but 100 Thieves did a really good job prioritizing him in the back half of this game. And Rich was also pretty solid on the Poppy in the top lane, but there's only so much that champion can do. Unfortunately, the other 2 players on this team just were not very good in this game. Whoever you want to give dud of the game to between XU and Isles, I think it's relatively earned for both. I don't think either played well. I'm going to give it to XU. The Vi was really, really not good here. River just completely out-jungled him in the early game. That's the second time that's happened this week, and then obviously he didn't really gather any sort of pressure in the back half, was consistently using ultimate to just try to lock down somebody on the back end of these fights, but was never actually dealing enough damage or setting anything up to, have Dignitas actually do anything with it, and so he ended up being pretty useless down the back of the game, as Vi can be when you're not able to get that early lead. I think Isles also could get this award here, the dud of the game here, because the Ashe was pretty bad. The positioning was not good, but the arrows were off. Just generally, it didn't feel like that champion had a big impact. I saw some people questioning why you would pick Ashe in this scenario. I think Jhin Ashe is actually a very scary lane to go into, even into something like Varus Senna. There are possibilities and options, I think, for that lane to just kind of win, but when Isles played the way that he did in this game, obviously becomes a lot more difficult. It's not a free win or anything like that. You have to go out there and play it. And unfortunately, XU and Isles just didn't have very good games. I think Dig is consistently in this spot where some of these players are playing okay, they're making games interesting, but they just have a really hard time actually generating leads against teams that know what they're doing. And I think that's probably going to be their downfall. They're going to be fun to watch. They're going to have some interesting games, but I really don't think this is a good League of Legends team. I don't think they're going to win a lot of games, and I think that was kind of shown here. But for 100 Thieves on the other side, again, like, what's really stopping them from being a top 4 team? With Liquid feeling very vulnerable right now, like, there is an opening in that top 4, and I think 100 Thieves theoretically could take that. I need to see more consistency out of the players that I really just don't know what we're getting. You know, Quid, Meech, Sniper, those 3 in particular, but River has been phenomenal to start this split, everything they could have asked for, and then someone as a veteran presence, that's huge. If he can continue to be this stabilizing force while these rookies continue to get better and better and better, this could be one of the scarier teams in the entirety of the LCS, even by the end of the spring split. And moving on to the second game of day number 2 here, and man, we just had to finally get to the big upset in the LCS. We usually kind of don't get these in the LCS, so it is very exciting to see Cloud9 taking on Shopify Rebellion. And of course, Shopify picks up their first ever LCS win in a game like this. Who really is all that surprised? I mean, I'm more surprised that it's happening to Cloud9 than it did to like G2 or BDS in the LEC, or if it happened to like Gen G over in the LCK, or whoever, right, like JD Gaming or BLG over in the LPL. I'm most surprised about Cloud9, not because I think that they are more unflappable than those other teams, but rather, this typically just doesn't happen all that much in the LCS. You don't usually get a ridiculous amount of big upsets like this in North America, just not typically the region where the bottom teams ever really do all that well, even in weird situations. But you know what? We're picking up from other regions, and we are learning their trades, and by that I mean our 0-3 team is able to beat our 3-0 team just as it should be in the stars. Let's go ahead and talk about what actually happened in this game, because this was kind of a stomp. Like, this game wasn't particularly close. Player of the game, B-Boy, no question. All of those people on social media after one game looking at B-Boy saying he's washed, saying this was a miserable signing, having never watched a single game of him in Brazil. This is the B-Boy that I saw in the offseason. The reason I said, honestly, that this was a better signing for them than keeping Wild Turtle was because his mechanical ceiling is actually really high, and he played the Varus at a very high level in this game. Very, very good positioning, knew when to be aggressive, knew when to play it a little bit safer to allow the rest of his team to be able to engage and create for him. This is a very weird draft. Obviously, a lot of people are going to point to the Scion mid being countered by the Vayne mid from Jojo Pume, thinking obviously he's Caps, but you know, I think B-Boy really was the star of this. The Varus was definitely the most noticeably good thing on this team. I want to give a big shout out to Boogie, who played the Lilia at a super high level. It is not easy to generate a ton of tempo into Blabber. Maokai kind of makes that a little bit easier, but Boogie still had to go out and do that after one of the worst games that he's played in quite a while earlier in the week against Immortals. Really nice to see him be able to do that. Zeyzal was awesome here. This is easily the best game he has played in this split. The Milio positioning was really good, being able to dodge a lot of the skill shots coming out from the Renata, I thought was super important, and just making sure that the Varus was always in as good of a possible spot as he could be. It was amazing. Insanity with Scion mid and actually being able to win the game on it. Pretty fun, pretty amazing stuff. You got to be really excited about that. Fake God on the Udyr was doing his thing, playing Udyr in the top lane, doing everything you should be doing. Overall, this was just a good game from Shopify, and man, you've got to be excited to hear that. There were so many things that could have gone wrong for this team after such a horrendous start, because truly, their start was horrendous. 0-3, losing to Immortals, not being in a good spot, you know, basically losing all momentum that you could possibly have from a TSM team that overachieved for the most part last year, but going back, you know, to the basics, drafting something really weird and getting your actual AD carry in there. Who would have known that that would actually be what snaps them out of this spell? Now, do I think this is something that's going to be repeatable over a large stretch of time? Only time will tell on that. I'm still very much 1 foot out on Shopify because these games are very weird. Beating a team like Cloud9 does not mean this team is better than Cloud9. We've seen that in a lot of other regions, but this is a very, very good place to start basically everything you could have asked for from this team, from this roster, and from these players. B-Boy, Zeyzal, Insanity, Boogie, Fake God, all looking very good against tough competition. But for Cloud9 on the other side, I'm not freaking out, really, at all. We've talked about how dominant this team has been through their first 3 games. Losing a game to a team they probably just completely underestimated, it's not concerning me. They drafted Vayne mid. Of course they lost this game. Is anybody really all that surprised? Honestly, JoJo was the best player on Cloud9 in this game, which he kind of has been over the course of this split anyways. The Vayne was actually doing quite a bit of work. He just couldn't carry the rest of this team. This is one of those Vulcan games. I think you guys remember those Vulcan games. He's going to get done of the game. We saw a lot of them on FlyQuest last year where it's like, every so often, he just plays completely miserably. He just has one of these games where he's walking up and dying for no reason. It's kind of similar to a player like Hylissang, except I don't really think they're like of similar styles. I wouldn't necessarily consider their play styles all that similar, but this was awful from Vulcan. One of the worst Renata games we've seen in a while. B-Boy completely outplayed him in a lot of these skirmishes in the 2v2 and was able to generate a large lead because of it. He was really bad in team fights. Even the ultimates, which are pretty guaranteed if you're a good Renata player, were just not very good in this game for Vulcan. So definitely something to at least look out for. This was not a particularly good performance on that front. Blabber did get out jungled, but a lot of that was him losing pressure in the early game because he's playing against, a Lilia who's just going to be able to accelerate a lot of the tempo of these games very quickly, and he just was never able to match and catch back up. That's fine. You can live with that if you are a Maokai player, but the team fighting wasn't enough to be able to bring it back. Fudge was whatever on the top side, and then Berserker didn't do nearly enough on the Kalista to be able to shut down the Varus on the other side of this matchup. A lot of that had to do with the fact that his support kind of ran it down for a lot of this game, but still, at the end of the day, this is just one of those games where you lose a little bit early, you don't have tempo in the jungle, you draft a weird mid laner, and you aren't able to get as much prio as you want, and your support has, a bad game, and because of that, you lose. And you can, again, live with that. You're only 3-1 at the end of the first 4 games, but those 3 games were still super dominant in those wins. And so I'm not freaking out about Cloud9. This is still the best team in the LCS. This is just a weird outlier. But for Shopify, hopefully this is kind of the push they need to get themselves back on track here. I had pretty high expectations for this team heading into the split. They were number 5 in my power rankings to start the year, and I think a lot of people had them in a similar range. They really have not lived up to that at all outside of this performance, but if B-Boy can continue to play at a high level, if Boogie gets some of his confidence back, and if these weird picks in the mid lane keep going, Insanity was certainly not afraid of them last year, pulling out things like Graves mid a bunch over the course of the split. If those are the things that Shopify, ends up getting known for and ends up playing around, I think this team's going to find a lot more success, and so this is the blueprint. We'll just have to see if they can continue to capitalize on that throughout the rest of spring, I guess. And then moving on to game 3 here of day 2, and this for me was my game of the week, my match of the week here in the LCS. It was Energy taking on FlyQuest. Very excited to see how this turned out, and it turned out with an Energy win, going to 3-1, giving FlyQuest their first loss of the split as well, alongside Cloud9. Neither team going into week number 3 undefeated. That means nobody in the LCS going into week number 3 undefeated, and big win for Energy. This team continues to look really, really good. I really like just how versatile they are, how difficult it is to prepare for them, because they honestly can win through anything. You can look at, how FlyQuest ended up playing this game and say, okay, well, maybe they should have given more attention to the bot lane. Inspired had to really reroute a lot of its game plan and its pathing to try and make sure that bot was a lot safer because of the aggression that was shown by Energy, but think about it in draft. How do you know that that's what they're going to do here? Obviously, you want to play towards Kalista in the early game with this comp, but you have to be cognizant of the Azir. You have to be cognizant of Dokla, who's going to play super aggro on the top side of this map, and you've got a strong top side, and so you want to play towards that. There are so many things that keep this from being an easy, situation for anybody on FlyQuest, and that's more of a credit to Energy than it is to, a negative towards FlyQuest. So credit to them. Player of the game pretty easily. This one's going to Huhi in the support position. Amazing performance from him on the Rel. He's been amazing over the course of this week. He has really done everything that he's needed to do, and this guy's just fantastic. I saw a conversation on Reddit, I believe in the post-match thread, where they were asking, when do we start having that conversation about Huhi contesting Core JJ for being the best North American support ever, or the best LCS support ever, I should say. And I certainly think there is a conversation for that. I think the 3 obviously are, Core, Huhi, and Aframu. Whatever order you want to put those 3 in, depending on how you feel about their overall accomplishments, I think is a generally fair rating, but Huhi has earned himself being in that conversation, I think, at this point. For the last 4 or so years, he has at worst been a top 2 support in the region, maybe top 3 in situations where Core and Vulcan are really good, but like he's the best support in NA right now, and it's not particularly close. He just makes play after play after play. He did it last year for Golden Guardians. He's doing it again here for Energy this year. An amazing player, a really good laning phase here. He made Masu's life just a living hell in this game. It's, he's a young player. He's going to be able to make mistakes, but who he really targeted and capitalized on some of the mistakes that Masu was making in this one, and, bot lane was a disaster for FlyQuest, so credit to FBI for also pressuring that advantage. He has also sneakily been phenomenal over the start of this split. He was great earlier in the week. He was really good in this game as well, and it's not on these, ridiculously broken picks. I mean, you could argue Kallista's the best ADC in the meta. That's certainly a conversation you can have, but he did it earlier this week on Jhin as well. He's just so consistent, and he capitalizes on things that are created for him just as good as any AD carry in the West. Absolutely. He is a lot better than people think he is, and he's always going to be better than people think he is. People have underrated him his entire career. He's just a very well-rounded, very good AD carry that's great in lane, really solid in team fights, can be proactive. I like FBI a lot, and I really like this bot lane back together. We're seeing the confidence come back. Contracts was amazing on Ivern, and this is one of his signature picks. This and the Sejuani really do feel like the two champions that he has had the most success on over the course of his recent career here on CLG and Energy, and I think there's reason for that. Both of them allow him to be super aggro and play really fast and loose because he's sitting there and helping his teammates play fast and loose, and I think that is something that helps him out a lot. Palafox continues to have amazing mechanics on his ear. Dokla was amazing on the Cassante. It's almost underrated just how good he was in lane going up against Bwipo's Darius. Not a particularly easy matchup, and Dokla made it look incredibly easy. He just outplayed Bwipo in this game. Overall, Energy was just better. Across the board, I think all 5 members ended up outplaying their opponents, and I think that is a major, major positive to go, for a team that is playing against an undefeated roster right now. And so for FlyQuest on the other side, you gotta live with that. You gotta live with the fact that you were just kind of outskilled in this game. Energy had a game plan and you had to match it. Bot lane kind of got destroyed. Masu is gonna get my dud of the game. It's rough sailing, being given such a big task so early on in your career, but FBI and Huki came out with a statement to make in this game, and unfortunately Masu was the target for that. He ended up dying a lot in laning phase, was able to recoup some gold in the mid game because of, some traded fights with Inspired there, but for the most part, Masu's, a lack of pressure in the early game ended up really costing FlyQuest, I would say, over the course of this. Busio wasn't much better on the Renata. Generally, this was a pretty big bot gap. I think people are going to credit Inspired for adapting, I should say, his mentality and, continuing to try and protect bot lane. That really sucks that he had to basically give up the game to try and make sure bot lane would survive, but at the same time, Contracts was already out jungling him at that point, and you got to give him a lot of credit for that. Inspired was not his best in this game, and I certainly think that this was his worst performance of the season up until this point. Jensen really never was able to get to the point where he could be relevant on the Corki, and Bwipo got completely outplayed in the top lane matchup. Generally, like I said, FlyQuest was just outmatched across the board. Energy was the better team in this one, and that's where you have to give a lot of credit. FlyQuest is still a good team, but Energy's holding on to that number 2 spot in the power rankings for a good reason right now. I'm really excited to see where these two teams go into the future, because I think both of them are very talented, and obviously one game is not enough for me to say FlyQuest can't bounce back and put themselves in a good spot this season, but this was a statement-defining game from Energy, and I expect this, streak of very, very good success for them to continue. And then moving on to our 4th and final game of day number 2 now, in the 8th and final game of the week here, we had Team Liquid taking on Immortals. And Team Liquid is going to be able to pick up the win here, a very important one for them. Obviously, if they had lost this, it would have been pretty big panic mode, because Immortals is not a particularly good team, no matter what their win over Shopify would tell you on day 1. But still, they're able to walk out of this week 1-1. They're able to walk into week number 3 at 2-2. And for such an underperforming team at the start of the split to be 500, I think that's a pretty good place for them to be at the current moment. If they can figure out some of their issues, I think they're going to be in an okay spot. But right now, some of these players are just individually performing very poorly from a mechanics standpoint, and there's reason to believe that that's going to become more of the norm rather than something that is, a little bit early season jitters, if you will. But for Immortals, this is much more, I think, what we've become accustomed to when it comes to this roster and when it comes to this organization. I think this is more of what we were expecting. Still a game where I think most of the players on Immortals were fine and generally kept up and kept the game interesting, but at the end of the day, they just don't have enough firepower to be able to compete with a team like Team Liquid. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Yan in the bot lane. A lot of people hate Yan. A lot of people really look at him super negatively, but again, I have to remind people that he is just a very divisive player in terms of his playstyle. He is very good in lane, he's very good in the isolated 2v2, even in matchups that he really shouldn't be. Like, he was awesome as Aphelios into Ezreal and Bard, and you really shouldn't have a ton of prio in that matchup, but he did anyways, and he's just not always going to be the most consistent late game carry. He's not miserable in that stage of the game. There are games where he is pretty bad, but for the most part, he is serviceable. He's just always going to be stronger as a laner than he is as a team fighter. That's just who he is. But when he can get these big leads and when the team does invest resources into him, he does look good, like in this game on the Aphelios. This is a champion that I really like him on. I think he does a really good job of being able to pilot Aphelios in a nice way. He just has a very good idea of where he needs to be on this champion at a lot of points in time. He understands the strengths and the weaknesses. You know, gun control combos and things like that are obviously, you know, that's obvious. Any pro player should be able to figure that out, but I think he does a really good job of knowing how to position on this champion depending on what gun combos he has going into a fight. I thought Core also was really good in this game on the Rakan. I don't really talk about Core a ton on this channel anymore, and I really do think that's because generally he's just kind of there. Like, he plays well. He's certainly not playing poorly. That's why I still consider him to be a top 3 support in North America. I just don't think he's a star anymore. He's just kind of an above average good player. Somebody that the team is happy to have, and I think he helps Jan with a lot of the mid-game, you know, problems that he ends up running into, but, you know, one that I think succeeds a lot of his spotlight, I guess, if you will say. I think a lot of people are going to look at, you know, APA's scoreline and think that he had a particularly good game. Got a quadra kill towards the back half here on Tristana. Before that, this was not a great game from APA. He just continues to look a little bit out of his depth, a little bit too aggressive in that sense. A lot of jumping in on Tristana, not knowing the damage ranges and just kind of dying before he's able to do anything. It's definitely something to monitor. I like APA, but this is significantly worse than anything he showed last year. This is regression, and on that front, I honestly don't think played very well in this game either. I am pretty notoriously low on I have been over the course of his entire career. We saw a ton of people, you know, I think we see a lot of LCS viewers kind of catching up to that. A lot of the conversation around has been like, oh, I thought was like this really big import from Korea, like he was this really high prioritized, great pather, great early game player. You know, and I hear people saying now, even like the conversation has been like, this is the worst has played in many years. I actually think this is just who has been. Like, I don't really think there's any difference in what is doing right now for Team Liquid and what he has been for Bro over the past 2 years, but that's just my opinion. I think he was always going to be a mediocre jungler at this level at the absolute best. Impact is cool on the top side. Udyr is pretty unkillable, but you can maybe make the argument Castle was better in this game. Castle had a really good game on the Cassante. Generally, I think what pushed TL across the finish line was just this Aphelios and some really good engages coming out from Core JJ on the Rakan. So credit to the bot lane for winning them this game. They did a lot of that last year too, and people kind of don't recognize them for that. Immortals though, you know, some positives. Castle, tactical, looked really good in this game. Castle has a very good understanding of how to play Cassante. That's been very clear, I think, over the beginning part of this split. If he can continue to just kind of grow that repertoire, get a little bit more comfortable in this stage of, you know, like where he's at, you know, playing for a bad team and not necessarily having some of the resources he might have had when he was playing for KT Rolster's Challengers team, I think he's going to be fine. Like, mechanically speaking, he's actually a pretty interesting prospect. You can say the same thing about Mask. I certainly think this game wasn't particularly bad from him on the Azir. Tactical continues to look very good on this Immortals team, basically regardless of what everybody else is doing. And Ole had some nice ultimates, but at the end of the day, Armeo played pretty awful in this game. He's going to get dead of the game. The Vi engages were just about as bad as you can get. Generally, I always talk about this. If you don't have a lead on Vi going into the mid game, you often just become this champion that presses R, hits the ultimate, and then immediately dies because you don't have the survivability. You don't have the item advantage to be able to capitalize on Vi's kit all that well. That's why I don't necessarily consider her the most consistent or safe jungler in the meta, and we kind of saw that here, but Armeo's pathing was miserable in the early game. It just doesn't feel like he was very comfortable on this champion, which is weird because he's played her a lot, and so I don't really know what was going on in this game. This was just a very bad one. Armeo is just kind of a below average jungler at this level, it would seem. You know, I was pretty high on him after his year on EG. Last year, I thought he was fine for that team. Honestly, you know, kind of underrated in terms of the impact that he had, especially for the most part in the summer split, but I think this team is just going to be a little bit of a hard place to win. I think generally, again, Immortals looks fine. I think that's how most bottom tier LCS teams look. They look fine. They just don't show a lot of creativity, and they really aren't able to close out games against teams that know what they're doing in team fights. And that's what Immortals is, a team that's not really able to win a lot of these. And so as much as I think there is development going on with some of these players, I really don't think it's going to be coming together to make an interesting team. But for Team Liquid, again, nice win. I think less of their players played well than Immortals, which is very funny to say, but Jan and Core were the two best players in this game, which definitely pushed them over the top. They're going to need to stabilize, though. Jungle mid looks like a weakness for this team at the current moment. Impact is just kind of there on the top side. He's coasting on reputation more than he is on gameplay at the current moment. You know, Jan and Core are inconsistently good. Jan really struggles when he doesn't get any early game lead, and so TL has some very obvious, like, stylistic disadvantages, you know, in the LCS right now, and if they don't clean those up, they're not going to be a top 4 team, but at least for now, you know, it's very debatable whether or not this team could get better, and I think at least we have to see what they're going to do over the second half of this split. It's only 4 games in. I don't want to overreact. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCS Week 2 overview and analysis video and coverage of all 8 games. Up on the screen right now, you're going to see the updated LCS standings after 2 weeks of action, 4 games of action. Of course, any ties are just going to be broken alphabetically, still in the stage where basically everybody is tied somewhere. Nobody is undefeated and nobody is winless. That's a pretty good thing to say about the LCS. There is some parity in the league, but of course, as you can see on the screen of the information listed on the right, the one on the top is going to be my power ranking for that team in particular, 1 to 8, where I personally power rank them right now after week 2. In the second thing, that's going to be where they have changed from last week to this week, if they have risen or if they have fallen in the power rankings, and of course their streak is there as well. We can talk about some of the risers and fallers, but again, very similar to week 1, there just aren't a lot of changes. In fact, I was very close to not making any changes, but the only change I ended up making was moving Dignitas up to 6 and Shopify down to 7. I really do feel a bit more comfortable in Dignitas right now. I feel like Rich, Dove is playing better than I'm expecting. You know, Tomo's had a couple of good games here and there. Isles, I think, will get better. XU, I think, will get better. I think there are positives to Dig, and Shopify is just yet to find any sort of consistency. Yes, they got that win over Cloud9, but again, I chalk that up to, like, weird stuff a bit more. Now, if B-Boy comes out next week and continues to play at a really high level, if this team can continue finding kind of a niche that they can play towards with some weird mid lane picks and Boogie kind of capitalizing off that like they did in the regular season last year as TSM, then this team is going to rise back up because they looked better in that game against Cloud9 than anything Dignitas has looked all split long. But until they show that they can do that consistently, they're going to fall to number 7 after that loss to Immortals. I just can't ignore it. Immortals is going to stay at 8, even though they beat Shopify, because I truly do believe they are worse as a team, and I can't reasonably put them above 8th. They're the worst team in the league right now, but everything else staying the same. Top 5 staying the same. Cloud9, Energy, FlyQuest, Team Liquid, and 100 Thieves. 100 Thieves has a case to be made to be number 4, but for now, Liquid gets to hold on to that spot until they really prove that they can't anymore. But those are my updated power rankings. Again, let me know if I should have made more changes down in the comment section below. Would love to know what your thoughts are on that. But time to move into player of the week and dud of the week. And this one, pretty easy conversation to have, at least for me. Player of the week, no-brainer, is going to go to FBI. He was pretty clearly the best player in the LCS this week. I think the only person you can really push him is the other main runner-up here. Honorable mention in his bot lane partner, Huhi. It was one of the members of the Energy bot lane. Whether you want to give it to FBI, whether you want to give it to Huhi, I think they both played outstanding this week. I'm giving it to FBI mostly because I thought his Jhin game was the most fun to watch, but he was great on the Callista in game number 2 as well. Huhi was great in that Rel game in game number 2, but I thought FBI was just a little bit more noticeable. Either way, they were the 2 best players in the LCS this week, and I really think that was an easy choice. The other runner-up, B-Boy, the AD carry for Shopify. I know not a lot of people are going to expect this, but he, first of all, was amazing in that game against Cloud9, but even in their loss against Immortals, he was definitely the best player on that team, and in a league where there really weren't a lot of players that were consistent through both games that they played this week, B-Boy was probably one of the more consistent ones. So FBI getting player of the week for week 2, Huhi and B-Boy being my runners up. But again, if you wanted to give this to Huhi, I really wouldn't complain all that much. And then dud of the week for me, also a relatively easy choice. This one's going to XU, the jungler for Dignitas. He had a pretty good week 1, especially that win over Immortals where he looked really good in that game, but it just wasn't quite as good of a week number 2. Dignitas is really starting to show some of their flaws, and I thought XU very much just kind of got outclassed this week, played a couple of good teams, and so I'm not going to sit here and say that it's over for XU. There's nothing he can do to turn it back around, but, you know, I just don't think he had a particularly good week. I still like him a lot as a player and as a prospect, but he was probably the worst performing member in the LCS this week, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below what you agree with and what you disagree with. If you did enjoy the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content. And it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We cover the LCS every single week here on this channel. And with the Super Week coming up, you definitely want to be around for that. We also cover all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL, Tier 2 here in North America every single week. And so if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.